Welcome to this screencast on developing with the Microsoft Graph. Let me first talk a little bit about what this screencast is and what you can expect from it before we start diving into the content. This screencast is going to accompany a hands-on lab and a training module that you can take advantage of that goes along with everything you're going to find in this screencast. Specifically, you're going to find in this screencast is really going to be an example of someone presenting the content from the training module as a way for you to learn how you could use this module and delivering it to a different user group or at a conference. However, you can also use it as self-paced learning. Now, the way that this module is set up is that it's broken up into a series of a couple different sections. We'll go through each one of them in just a few minutes. Each one of these sections is going to finish with a demonstration. Now, the demonstration, we don't walk through the entire step of creating the application or walking through the steps of writing all the code. Instead, we look at the final solution that has already been built and kind of pick through the code and pick through the important parts that you should take advantage of or you need to take note of. And we'll see it working as well. If you want to go through and you want to build the application, you want to see how it's being built, then what we would recommend that you do is go check out the hands-on lab that accompanies this module. Because the hands-on lab, each of the exercises maps to one of the demos inside of this screencast that you're going to see. So if you want to see how to build it and you want to walk through the steps, you can walk through the hands-on lab exercise that accompanies this module and get to the exact same place that we're showing you here in the screencast. Instead, we're not going to show in the screencast all the individual steps of creating the application. And part of that is because things change on a rapid cadence, and the lab is going to have the most updated steps and dependencies and stuff that you're going to need. The screencast is more or less showing you how the thing works or how the final solution works. So that's how you can learn more about taking advantage of this content and how we've structured this. Let's go ahead and dive into the actual module itself. In this first section, we're going to start by building an iOS native application with the Microsoft Graph REST API. And specifically, we're going to be looking at building native iOS Objective-C apps, working with the Microsoft Graph. In this first section, what are we going to look at in depth? We are going to focus on an introduction to the Microsoft Graph API, getting started, and then we're going to dive into the iOS point of view. So the iOS development experience and creating an iOS application for Azure AD and the Microsoft Graph. Office 365 Developer Vision focuses on the user's experience and their data. And as a developer, you can bring your application into the user experience. With over 1.2 billion users of Office worldwide, this is a huge opportunity to provide a window into your application, as well as being able to connect into their data and add intelligence to your application. There are currently over 850 million events created each month and a total of over 400 petabytes of data stored in the service that can add value for your users. The Microsoft Graph is the gateway to your data in the Microsoft Cloud. As you see there from the bottom of the list, we've got a lot of different services and data types that we can actually take advantage of from Office 365 and Microsoft. And it's all considered part of the Microsoft 365 platform. We can work with mail and calendar, contacts, tasks. We can work with content inside of SharePoint sites and lists, files inside of OneDrive, things inside of Microsoft Teams, users inside of Azure Active Directory. There's so many different things that we can take advantage of. The nice thing here is that each one of these different services usually has its own API where we can talk to these different services to get the data out. It can be challenging to go get the data from all these individual services as they each have their own endpoints, they may have their own permissions, and that also means that with their different access control that we have and talking to these different services using an OAuth style authentication via Azure Active Directory, that means that each one of these different endpoints is going to have to require their own access token. One of the nice things about the service called the Microsoft Graph is that the Microsoft Graph is going to serve as a proxy endpoint to all of these other different services. It's going to encompass things such as Office 365, Windows 10, and Enterprise Mobility and Security. And it brings all of these different services under one top-level service called graph.microsoft.com. The advantage to using the Microsoft Graph is that it's going to allow you to just have a single point resource, which means you're only going to need a single access token to be able to talk to all these different services. They still have their own individual permissions, or as we refer to them as scopes, so that everything is still secured in a very individual way. but this makes it easier for developers to build applications. All Office 365 cloud services, including SharePoint Online and the Microsoft Graph, leverage Azure AD for authentication and authorization. This means there's a single authentication flow that you can use inside of your Office 365 applications, as well as those created to leverage the Microsoft Graph. This single authentication flow means that we're just going to have one way that we have to log in to all of these different services and obtain an access token, either using a web application or a native application. It also has a whole consent model. We'll look at that a little bit more in a future section. Everything is also very secure. Everything is based off the OAuth 2 protocol, which means that the application that you build is never going to collect user credentials. We're always going to redirect them over to Azure AD, have the users log in, and then Azure AD will provide my application that I can build as a developer with a special code that the application can then use to exchange for an access token to be able to call these different endpoints and services, such as the Microsoft Graph, on behalf of these different users. We also have some very fine-grained permissions, otherwise known as scopes, so that users can only grant the application specific permissions of different things that they want to allow the application to do. And then we can also have some special considerations that we have to take into account if we're building native applications. So there's some things like when you build a web application, you have a client ID and secret. You can protect the secret because there's server-side code that the web application doesn't have to expose to the end users. But as we'll talk about a little bit later, the native applications do have a little bit of a challenge where once the code has been distributed, we can't include both the client ID and the secret, because if we distribute the secret, well, technically it's no longer a secret anymore. We'll see how this works in a native application in just a little bit. Now, Office 365 has a single authentication flow for Office 365 and the Microsoft Graph. Users are going to sign in using a technology called OpenID Connect, which is an open standard. And what that does is that once people have logged in, there's this nice little envelope wrapper that will include details about the individual who's just logged in. Azure AD is going to be used for all of the authentication. The Microsoft Graph is built on top of the authentication model of Azure AD. Office 365 is also built on top of the authentication model of Azure AD. So both of these services trust Azure AD. By having this single level of trust or single service that they both trust, then we can leverage the authentication to take advantage of both of these different services with the same authentication flow. This authentication flow is also going to support multi-factor authentication, also referred to as MFA, and federated user sign-ons. And it's going to support all different kinds of applications, from device applications such as those on a mobile device, websites, single-page applications that live 100% in the client, or as a headless application with no user involvement, also referred to as a daemon or as a service-based application. You'll be able to pin applications to your Office 365 app launcher from the My Apps page, which is like that little menu that you have in the top left corner within Office 365. Now let's talk a little bit about working with iOS development for the Microsoft Graph. The Microsoft Graph team does have a native SDK for iOS that they do provide that is available on GitHub. However, it requires ADAL for iOS for authentication. It only uses the V1 endpoint. Microsoft Graph really recommends using the V2 endpoint. And so in this module, what we focus on using is the REST API for the Microsoft Graph. And so in that case, we're going to be leveraging the Microsoft Authentication Library for iOS to log in and obtain an access token. And then we're just going to call the Graph REST API directly. So what does development look like for iOS? A developer is going to use a tool called Xcode, which is a free IDE that's provided by Apple. And you're going to do all of your app registration using the Azure AD admin portal. There are other portals that were available, like the Azure Management Portal and the App Registration Portal, but we focus on using the Azure AD admin portal instead. As far as the SDK integration, you're going to leverage a tool. You could actually leverage two tools. You could either leverage CocoaPods or Carthage, but we're going to leverage CocoaPods in our project. And CocoaPods is really just a build and a management tool that's commonly used in iOS development. It's similar to MS Build and NuGet for .NET projects. Now, When you decide to do native or mobile development, you have to decide if you're going to go with a cross-platform option or if you're going to focus on more of a native process or native development. Now, when you have specific device capabilities you want to take advantage of, so like for example in iOS, if you want to take advantage of things like say the Force Touch or Face ID or things that are just specific to iOS, you're going to be primarily working with the native SDKs because they're the things that are going to support things that are only available on iOS. Furthermore, if you have complex or advanced user experiences and or visualizations, those things you're going to want to leverage on your in the native experience. You can take advantage of cross-platform development using tools like Xamarin or Cordova. They have their own advantages and disadvantages. We're not going to focus on that experience in this module. They do have some productivity gains because then you can do the same kind of development for an iOS device and a Android device, for example, and a Windows device. But with the native experiences, you're always going to get closer to the metal, which means you can do more capabilities, more hardware level capabilities here. So let's look at the experience of creating an iOS native Objective-C based application. So you're going to create the application using Xcode, and you're going to implement the user experience. And this is similar to really any kind of native development that I would recommend that you do. You want to build your application and kind of get a working wireframe or prototype of the flow of the application, and then you start adding the business logic. So like the third step would then be to extend the app support, authentication, and token acquisition from Azure AD. And then the last step is implementing the Microsoft Graph into your application, either the SDK or the REST API. So what does the experience actually look like? Well, you're going to create a native iOS application using Xcode and then implement the user experience. We're going to do that in our first demo here in just a minute. Or I'm going to show you how I did it. We're going to walk through some of the parts of the application. And then you test the application prior to implementing authentication and integrating the Microsoft Graph. And this makes sure that your application works. It's got a nice flow to it before you start adding in the complexity of all the business logic that you're going to have to implement there. So in this first demo that we're going to look at an iOS application that I've already built with Xcode, and I've already created the screen flow of how everything is going to work. And we'll look at some of the code of how we've implemented this, where the different login buttons are set up and how the things are wired up. Just like our other modules that related to the Microsoft Graph and these screencasts, inside of this demo, I'm showing you a pre-built application simply for the interest of time and the length of this screencast. If you want to see how to go about building this application yourself, go check out the module that's associated with this screencast. In the first exercise of the hands-on lab is going to have you walk through and build the same application that I'm building here. Things change in this cloud world where SDKs change, version numbers change, some of the experiences in Xcode may change as well from the time we recorded this screencast. The hands-on lab is always updated every few months, so you know that all the detailed steps are there. So while you're not going to see the entire process in the screencast of building the app, go check out the hands-on lab. It walks you through that process. But enough of that, let's go ahead and dive into the demo. Okay, so as we talked about previously, in this demo, what I want to show you is the application that we've built, and I want to explain kind of how it's been organized, how it's been laid out, and some of the settings that we chose. And then if you want to build this application yourself, the best approach is to go check out the module that is associated with this screencast, and it will walk you through creating the application as it's got a hands-on lab exercise that walks through all the details of this application. So what I've done here is I've created a standard Objective-C based application here. And you can see here I've gone ahead and I've got my storyboard that I've defined. Now, the way we've set this up is I added in something called a navigation controller. Now, the way you do that is up here in the corner. If I select this little box here and I type in navigation controller, I just drag this navigation controller over here onto the surface, and that added in these two elements you see here. So you can see my navigation controller, and I have this kind of a table view kind of experience that you see right here. So this navigation controller, to make sure that this is the first thing that loads on my application, is that when I select it and I come over here to the attributes inspector, then I can set it as the initial view controller on my application. And that's what's creating this kind of like shaded kind of arrow coming in to say that this is the first thing that's going to get created here. I then went through and I created a view controller that's going to be used by the new view that we're going to create. So that's this view right here we're going to use for our sign-in. This is when someone comes into the application, I want them to come straight to this sign-in experience. So what I then did is I wanted to create a new view that you see listed here. So what I did is I created a new Cocoa-Touch file called my login view controller. And you can see here that I've defined a login button, a log out button, and a activity indicator as well for this. Now, if I look at the actual implementation of this file and of the interface, what you can see here is I've just set a couple methods here. So the view did load. I'm going to set the activity indicator. I'm going to make him hidden. There's a message that I can show. So that's going to be a little dialogue that we're going to display, and we'll see what that looks like in just a minute, or how that's being used. So to show message, there's a message being passed in and a title. Scroll down a little bit farther, there's the login action. So when I click login action, I'm going to call show loading UI, which is right up here. What that does is that's just showing a title of a dialogue. I'm showing the activity indicator, starting the animation. The login button is now disabled. And just a couple of things. I'm connecting to it, and then I'm saying signing into Microsoft when it's loading or not loading. There, I'm going through and I'm then enabling or disabling the login button and enabling the log out button. And when I click log out, I then toggle the show loading UI. So I'm toggling it. Here you can see loading. So I'm no longer loading. So now down here, stop the animation, no longer signing in. And then farther down, you can see where I'm saying I'm signing out of it. And I'm changing the enabled status of my two buttons that you see right here. Now I want to create the initial login screen. So I'm going to come back over here to my storyboard. And what I did is I added in a new view controller. So if I do controller, there's my view controller. I dragged it and dropped it here onto the design surface. Once I did that, I then went through and when I selected this, I then went and selected the view controller that you see right here in the storyboard. I selected it on this navigation panel that you see here. And what I did is underneath the utilities panel or the identity inspector, I binded it to the login view controller as the code behind for this. Now, once I did that, I then added in a few more controls. You can see I've got a text control, 2 buttons, and an activity control right here. And then I went ahead and I set all their names and properties. So here when I select this text right here, you can see when I go to when I went to the properties for it on the text, you can see I've defined his title as the Office 365 calendar event and then just change the font. Here is a button. This button says sign in to Microsoft. Down here, I've got the sign out button. So there's sign out from Microsoft. And then there's my activity control as well that has his own ID. Now, what you end up having to do is you want to go through, you want to bind these different buttons. You want to bind them to these different handlers. So like the login action, the logout action, and you also want to bind them to the actual objects like the buttons that you have here. So the way that you're going to do that, you come back over here to the storyboard. What I did is that you select the button, and then over here you've got this inspector here called the connections inspector. And you can see I've already got these things set up here. But let's just say, for example, that when I wanted to handle when this button was actually clicked, let's just say that I say touch down. So I'm going to grab this little circle here and drag it in over into this surface, and it shows me what action do I want to run for this thing right here, right? So I could choose those different actions. Same thing when I wanted to go through the referencing outlets. What was the button here? I just grab this control, drag it in, and I would bind it to what I was looking to do there, right? I did the same thing for the log out button. So you can see the log out button is bound to the login view controller, and that's actually bound to the logout button. And then the touch inside and outside, that actually shows here the logout action with this. And then here's my activity one as well, which shows that I was binding this control here to the actual control inside of the the application. Now, the next thing I needed to do is I needed to change the storyboard flow, because this thing was just floating out here by itself. This line that shows right here was not visible by default. And so what I did is I came over here, I was on the storyboard, and what I did is I came over here to the navigation controller scene that I have listed here. And so here's my navigation controller. And so what I did to make this link show up is I then pressed Control and I dragged this controller down like this to say this is where I wanted it to go. And once I did that, it says, well, how do you want to set up the segue here? And I said the relationship segue for this is going to be the root view controller. All right. So what that does now with this little arrow here is it shows that the application is first going to load the navigation controller, and then this guy is going to load our login view controller. And now this thing is now orphaned. We're going to address this later, though, in a when we go to integrate the Microsoft Graph, because once I'm logged in, I want to be taken over here. So let's test out our user interface. I'm going to come over here and hit play. What that's going to do is that's going to go build our application and launch it in the iPhone emulator here. So you can see there's my application. I click sign into Microsoft. That should say I'm signing in, launching a browser-based login. Again, we haven't done anything with this because we're just dealing with the UX. So I go ahead and click OK, but you can see here the button is switched to connecting, the title of what's going on, launching the browser login, I'm signing in, and you see the activity indicator is running. If I click OK, we can see that the buttons are now set back to where they were. I go hit sign out. You can see that's disabled, signing out from it. I click OK, done, right back to where we were. So now we have our working application. So the next step is going to be to add in the Microsoft Authentication Library and the Azure Active Directory Authentication to our application. We're going to see how to do that in the next section. In this section, we're going to talk about building an iOS native app with the Microsoft Graph REST API. And specifically in this case, we're going to talk about integrating the Azure AD authentication in our native iOS application. We're going to specifically focus on an overview of the authentication, Azure AD, the app registration process using the Azure AD admin portal, and then implementing the Microsoft Authentication Library in iOS. This slide. Azure AD OAuth is also a very secure protocol. And I talked about this in the last section. But the big thing here to take note of is that the OAuth 2 protocol does not allow the application, or it doesn't encourage the application to collect user credentials to be able to log into some other service like the Microsoft Graph or Azure AD. Instead, what we're going to do, and you'll see this in the demo, is that instead we are going to code up our application to send the user somewhere else to go log in, which is Azure AD. They're going to do that by popping up a browser on the device. And then it's going to give control back to Azure AD is going to give control back to the application and provide it with a code that was signed by Azure AD. The application can then use that code to go back to Azure AD and say, this code is something that you provided the user, and I need to get an access token on behalf of this user. And that code contains all the information that Azure AD needs to provide that token. This process also supports very fine-grained access scopes. We refer to access scopes also as permissions. It also supports different types of authentication, so such as multi-factor auth and federated user sign-ins. And these tokens are only going to be valid for a very limited amount of time. But for user consent, we will also allow us to have refresh tokens where we can ask, our application can ask without user involvement for an updated token that they could use. Now, we do have some special considerations when it comes to native applications on a mobile device. These things are inherently multi-tenant, and we also have the challenge of dealing with an app secret. So in that process I talked about a minute ago, and we're going to look at it in more depth on the next slide, where the application receives a code and then goes back to Azure AD and says, hey, here's a code, I need an access token. When it does that, the application has to, I'm going to put it in air quotes, log in to Azure AD. And the way we do that on, like, say, a web-based application or on a service is that the application has its own credentials, a client ID and a client secret. Think of it like a username and password, but just for the app. Well, that we can't do that same process on a native app because we're going to be building some code, building our application, and then distributing that code to many, many users' mobile devices. And once that code's been distributed, well, if that code has a secret in it, then we've kind of compromised ourselves a little bit. And so with a native app, it works a little bit different. In a native app, we don't use an app secret. Instead, we only provide in a client ID. And then we have a special redirection URL that will be used for the by Azure AD that will hand back to the client application so that it knows that the authentication model is a little more secure and it's a little more tight. It's just not it doesn't use the client ID and secret that a web application can do because it can protect that model. And the application then in the top left corner will be able to take that authorization code and then go log into Azure AD and provide it this code and say, I need an access token for this user. Azure AD is going to look at that code and say, I can tell that this is a code that I created, I being Azure AD, because it was digitally signed by Azure AD with their private key. So they know that the contents of the code are valid because it has a digital signature that matches one that only Azure AD could have signed. So it trusts that service. So it will then take that code. It knows that in that code it says things like it was the user was me. They're trying to access the Microsoft Graph, and that it's coming from this application, this native app. So Azure AD will look inside of his database and say, has this user granted this application permissions to the Microsoft Graph? And the answer is yes, because that's what we just did. It will then create an OAuth access token, and it will hand that back in that diagonal line going from the bottom left to the top right that says issue token. It will send that over to back to the native application. And that access token will contain the user. It will contain the resource that the token is valid for, in our case, the Microsoft Graph. And it will contain all of the scopes or permissions that the user granted the application. And now, from the top left corner, the native app can then request make an access data request over to the Microsoft Graph. That's the horizontal line across the top going from left to right to the resource server, the Microsoft Graph. The Microsoft Graph will get that token, it will look at the token, and it will say, is this token valid? It knows it's valid because it's going to look at the digital signature, and it knows that it's going to be able to match the digital signature against the public key that Azure AD uses, because the only thing that's going to match is the private key that Azure AD uses. So Microsoft Graph can say, I trust that this access token was created by Azure AD and the application's giving it to me. It's then going to open up that access token and know that I can see that this is a request for this specific user. This access token is intended for the Microsoft Graph and it has these permissions. So it will then access the data that's being requested and then hand that back to our native OAuth client, our native application. And that's how the whole authentication dance and authentication flow is going to work here. You notice here that both the client and the resource server need to know about the authorization server, which in our case is Azure AD. Let me talk a little bit about different endpoint versions that we have in Azure AD. We have a V1 endpoint and a V2 endpoint. V1 came first, obviously. V2 came second. Now, how did this work? Well, in the V1 endpoint, there was two characteristics to it that are worth noting here, and why we don't use it in a scenario for the Microsoft Graph anymore. One of the scenarios is that Azure AD only supported, in the V1 endpoint, only supported the Azure Active Directory authentication. It did not support any other styles of authentication. And so what that meant is that if the user was logging in with a personal account or consumer account, also known as a Microsoft account, and they wanted to access things like their OneDrive consumer account or their Outlook.com account, things like that, our application would have to know what kind of account they were signing in with, and we would have to send them to a whole different authentication model. So that's one downside, because Azure AD or the V1 endpoint only supported work and school accounts or accounts with that leveraged Azure AD. The other challenge that we had is that with a V1 endpoint, it required what's called static consent, which meant that every single permission that our application was going to need when the user first logged in, they were going to have to grant all the permissions up front at that time. They had to declare everything at the very first time. But what that's going to allow us to do then is that we don't have to worry about that extra complexity. We're going to let Azure AD figure all that out for us. So that's one nice thing. That's the first 2 points. Converged authentication accepts sign-in for both Microsoft personal accounts and Azure AD Work and School, and it enables the same code, the code that we write, for using the Microsoft Graph for things like reading mail and retrieving contacts. Now, the next thing that's really important here is the dynamic consent. And what's nice about this differs from V1, where we had static consent, where now every time you go to request a access token from Azure AD, you specify the permissions that you need for that access token. Now, let's say, for example, in the example I gave a minute ago, when the user went to log in, they had to grant all permissions that this application could possibly need up front. Well, now, when the user signs in, all I really need to do is I just need to request the user impersonation scope, and that's going to allow me to get information about the current user, just get their name, their email address, etc. And now they get a much better experience when they log into my app. Maybe they're only going to use the capability to reorganize their email into different folders. When they go to do that, I can request another access token that says I need mail.read and mail.write. And when I do that, then the user is only going to be prompted for those permissions if they had not already granted those permissions to the app. The next time they go to use the app, same thing. It's going to go check to see we need these permissions. Azure AD says, I can tell this user has already granted those permissions, so we don't need to go through that whole process a second time. But we don't have to request permissions for their calendar, for their tasks, or for their files in OneDrive. We only need to ask for that stuff when they actually need it. So I think that's a better experience because your users aren't hit with a lot of stuff. And you've seen a similar model with this, like on your mobile devices. An application may, like if you were going to use one of these social apps and you wanted to post something to this social network, let's say you just want to post some text. Well, it doesn't need a permission for that. But then if you wanted to, say, post a picture that you had taken, they need access to your photos on your phone. And so it prompts you for, do you grant this application access to your photos? Yes or no. The next thing is maybe I want to take a picture and have it send right away. So then it's going to ask for permissions to your camera. Or you want to do a little video. So now it wants permissions to your camera and your microphone. If you had installed the app and the first time you went to log in, it says, I need access to your microphone and your camera and your photos, you may be a bit turned off by the app and say, I don't want to give you all those permissions. I just want to post some text to this social network. That's what dynamic consent is all about. It allows you to incrementally just grant these permissions. And you can learn more about the V2 endpoint if you go to aka.ms/aadv2. Now let me talk about some of the other improvements from the V1 endpoint to the V2 endpoint. In the V1 endpoint, you had to provide a resource parameter to identify which resources you were requesting an access token for. And the challenge with this is that some of the open source libraries were not able to easily incorporate that into their requests. So now we use the scope parameter, which is supported by all the libraries to compound and combine both the resource and the permission. When you build applications with Azure AD V1, you also had to register all the permissions the application needed. That was called static consent. We just went through that a minute ago. The user had to consent to all of those things statically, but with V2, we can now send scopes that you want at the time you want them. We don't have to ask for them all up front. That's the dynamic consent. We're also going to change the contents of the ID token. This is the token that is going to be included with the response for the login that contains information about the current user, like their email address and their name, etc. And this is going to better conform to the OpenID Connect V1 specification. For example, we're using things like preferred username claim instead of a claim called UPN. And also in the past, if you needed a client application or a single page application or a web app or a web API or a daemon service, we had to create multiple Azure AD registrations and wire up each of the relationships between each one of those. And it was a bit of a pain. But now in the V2, this now is going to enable us just one app registration across a single logical application. and we can then open up all the different areas that we support for the different applications, such as representing a native and a web application if we wanted to. For more information, you can use that link at the bottom of the slide to learn more about the V1 versus V2 key improvements. Now let me talk a little bit about working with the different SDKs when it comes to Azure AD. Now the nice thing about this is that you really are going to self-select yourself into which one you're going to use. If you're using the V1 authentication endpoint, you have to use the Azure Active Directory Authentication Library, or ADAL. It only works with V1. If you're going to be using the V2 endpoint with the dynamic consent and some of the other things we've talked about, which is the recommendation from the Microsoft Graph team, you're going to be using the Microsoft Authentication Library. This targets the V2 endpoint. It's got a new conceptual model of two different kinds of applications. One's called a public client app and one's called a confidential client app. A confidential client is one that has runs in a web experience where you can put both the client ID and the secret in the application, where a public client application is one going to be more like a native app, where I'm not going to be able to provide the secret. I'm only going to be providing the client ID. We also have a couple different platforms on where this is supported. There's MSAL.net for .NET Client, Windows Store, ASP or .NET Core, Android, iOS, Xamarin, Universal Windows platform. There's a JavaScript implementation, an Objective-C implementation for iOS and macOS, and an Android implementation as well. Now, where are we going to register our applications? This has changed a little bit over the years, but now where we would recommend that you go is to go to the Azure AD admin portal. That's at aad.portal.azure.com. Now, there's a bunch of advantages to using this. First advantage here is that you don't need to have a Azure subscription to get to the Azure AD admin portal. You can log in with either a Microsoft account or an Azure AD account. And you'll see in the demo, when we log into this, it looks like the Azure portal, except the options of all the different Azure resources that are available to us are all gone except for Azure AD. This new admin portal is also going to allow you to create and manage both V1 and V2 style Azure AD applications. So you can have access to both the V1 and the V2 authorization endpoints. You're also going to be able to leverage either ADAL or MSAL for authentication. And again, as I said in the last slide, that really is going to be dictated based on what you end up doing with using either the V1 or the V2 endpoint. But because we're dealing with a Microsoft Graph, as I said before, you really are going to want to focus on using the V2 endpoint. So what does it look like? Well, you're going to go to the Azure AD admin portal and you're going to create a new application. So here I give it a name and then I specify what account types are available to me. So I could say that I want to use, this is where you're really going to pick, are you going to support work and school accounts in Azure AD or Microsoft accounts? And the first two choices that you see there with accounts in the organization directory only or organizations in any organization directory, that basically is saying, is it multi-tenant or single tenant? The first option is saying single tenant, meaning only people inside of my Azure AD or inside of my organization can use this app. The second one is multi-tenant, saying the app's going to be registered in my Azure AD, but anybody can use it that has Azure AD. And then the last one is saying really anybody, both anybody in any Azure AD and anybody with a personal account, a Microsoft account or an MSA, such as a Skype account, an Xbox account, or an Outlook.com account. Once you've done that, your application's been created and you're going to have an application ID. So you're going to grab that ID and copy that down. And then you're going to have these redirect URIs. And this basically is going to say, once someone logs in, where should they be sent or what valid places can they be sent? And at the top, you see that there's a web option. And that's where if I was building a website, where would I redirect them to after they signed in? But that doesn't work on a mobile experience or on a native experience like on the desktop. And so instead, we're going to choose this first option here, which is using MSAL, which basically is going to have a special kind of a code that includes the ID of the application that the native SDKs are going to understand how to work with. Now let's talk about implementing Azure AD authentication for iOS apps. Azure AD provides an iOS implementation of the Microsoft Authentication Library that you can add to your project using CocoaPods, and I'll show you how that works inside the demo in just a few minutes. The Microsoft Authentication Library, MSAL, is going to handle the integration with iOS to use the default browser to display the Azure AD login page and the delegated consent experience. It works the exact same way as the Android implementation of the MSAL library as well. Now, the Microsoft Authentication Library and the Microsoft Graph iOS SDK are not compatible at this time. So if you're using MSAL, which is the recommendation, you should be using the Microsoft Graph REST API for the time being. Now in this demo, we're going to see how to add in the Microsoft Authentication Library for iOS into our native application. And then we're going to see how we can handle and configure our authentication with the app that we're going to create in the Azure AD admin portal. So let's go ahead and dive into this demo. Again, just like the other demos that we have in this module, some of the steps here we've already gone ahead and done ahead of time, and I'm just going to highlight stuff in the code. If you want to see all the steps of building the application, then I would recommend you take a look at the associated module with this screencast, as there's a hands-on lab exercise, specifically exercise 2, that walks you through all of the steps that are really going to encompass this demo. But let's go ahead and dive into it. Okay, so in this demo, we have a couple things we need to do. We need to first create an Azure AD application that we can use in our iOS application. And then we need to update the iOS application, or see how we've updated it, to leverage the Microsoft Authentication Library. So let's go about doing this. So the first step is to create your application in Azure AD. So I'm going to do that first. And I'm going to do that by logging into the Azure Active Directory Admin Center, as you see I've already done, and click on App Registrations. And let's create a new app. So I'm going to have this be called my native O365 calendar events. And I'm going to specify that we can use anything, any kind of login that we see here. And we're going to leave the redirect URI alone. So I'm going to go ahead and click register and create the application. Now I'm going to go ahead and copy the tenant or the application IDs. I'm going to need that later. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that and paste that in the clipboard off to the side. Now I'm going to also need to go in and set up a redirect URI here. And so the redirect URI, I'm going to select the MSAL option, and I'm also going to go ahead and copy this out because I might need this a little bit later. So go ahead and save those changes that we see there. Now I'm going to show you how to explicitly define the permissions. You don't need to do this because we can do the delegated permissions, but I'm just going to show you how to do it here. So under API permissions, I'm going to then go add a permission. I'm going to add a permission to the Microsoft Graph, and it's going to be a delegated permission because it's going to be on behalf of a user, and I'm going to do a search for calendar. So I'm going to use calendars.read scope. So I'm going to go ahead and select that and add the permission. And there we go. So now everything's been set up. So now I've been set up and we should be in good shape. So let's go through and let's look at our application. Now I'm going to go over to my application. So here's our application that we've set up. And a couple things that we've done with this. After I've gone through and I've created the app, and I've already gone through and set up all the UI and everything to it that I needed in order for this to work. The next thing that I want to do is I need to go through and set up the authentication piece. Now to do that, we're going to be using the Microsoft Authentication Library. And what I'm going to use is something called CocoaPods to install the Microsoft Authentication Library. So what I did is I created, inside the root of the project, I created a pod file. And then I added in this pod MSAL, and I'm looking for version 0.2. There may be a different version available by the time that you are watching this video, but in this case here, if you go through the demo in the hands-on lab that is associated with this module, it'll walk you through using the latest version. In this case here, I'm just going to use this version that you see listed here. And then once I've listed this out, I then went to the command prompt and I installed the pod file. So you can see here that now it went through and it downloaded all the stuff for MSAL that I needed for this application to work. I also went over here into this info.plist file. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at this guy as code. So let's open as source code. And if I scroll to the bottom here, what you'll see is I've added in all of this section that you see right here. And what it is that this is where I'm going to define the ID of my Azure AD application. So notice here it says MSAL and enter the client ID in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to grab that ID and copy that in that we had just created for our application a minute ago. Keeping a note that notice I'm not putting in the :// on the end. That's being defined separately, and the Microsoft Authentication Library is going to incorporate that inside of my application. So now what I'm going to do is come over here. If I look at the delegate, I'm going to load in the Microsoft Authentication Library, and then I'm going to add in, let's see, down here towards the bottom, I'm going to go ahead and add in this new method here for my application. And I'm going to add it in that's going to be creating a public client application, and this method here, it says handling the MSAL response. That is the part where when the browser opens and it takes me to Azure AD and I log in, we need to be able to get the response of when the browser closes, and that's how we're going to be able to get that response that way. Now, let's go in and let's create an authentication manager to help us with the authentication piece. So what I did is I went and created a new Cocoa file here called the authentication manager. And here I've done some stuff by setting up things like a shared instance. I've added a reference to MSAL. I've got a bunch of public members that I defined here that I'm going to take advantage of, and a bunch of methods: initializing with the authority, acquiring the token with a scope, acquire the token completion, clear the credentials, and then getting a redirect URL from the authentication library. So let's go implement this interface. So over here, to implement this interface, the first thing that we're doing is I'm adding in a reference to the MSAL header file. And then I'm going to add all this following code that's going to implement a constructor for the application here. So here I'm going through and implementing a method calling the init with the authority. This is doing all of the initialization of the application, defining things like the client ID and the authority of all that stuff that's being defined. The redirect URI is going to be coming from this method here that we were defining. You can see it's pulling back some of the data from that info.plist file, the bundle URL type. That's how it was getting things out, like the ID, like there's the client ID that came from that array that we're using. And then over here is where I'm trying to go through and actually like run the code to go handle like all the initialization of the login. Now the next thing I need to do is I need to implement a single static instance of the class. And so what I'm going to do is scroll down here. This is my singleton. So there's a shared instance right here. And here's where I'm just implementing or creating a shared instance of it. The next piece is I need to go define how I'm going to acquire the token. So that's this method right here. And when it's completed, this is the code that I'm going to want to run, that we're going to send people back to. So here I'm going to check to see if there's no users. This calls from the MSAL client, acquire token for scopes, passing in things like the client ID or fetching the client ID back, the access token from the result of a request, the current user, and their ID. And then I just call completion when everything has completed, right? Otherwise, there's some other code that's going to be running down here, acquiring it silently. This is where I'm getting the token interactively, and this is where I'm getting it silently if that's possible. So then a little bit farther down, I'm also going to define acquire token with completion. So that's just going to be when this runs, this is going to be calling the get redirect URL from the MSAL array, defining a couple different values that we're fetching back out of the array. And then this is the last piece where I'm going to go, when they log out, how do I clear the credentials out? So this is my helper class for the authentication manager. Now let's go through and let's implement this in my application. So here on the login controller, what I've done over here is up in the import piece, notice I'm importing in now my authentication manager and the Microsoft authentication library object call for a user. I'm then going to go through and define the authority. So the authority is the common endpoint for the authentication endpoint. And I'm then going to go also add in this property for my scopes for my login controller. Now, I need to then go through and replace the login action that we had with a real login action, because before when I clicked on it, it didn't really do anything. So let's go down and find our login action. Here's our login action. Here's where I'm going to define the scopes that I want. I want the user.read scope for the Microsoft Graph, and I want the calendars read scope. Now you saw a minute ago where I only had to add this scope. The users.read was already part of the Azure AD app as one of the default permissions. But this one is one that I added, the calendars.read. I didn't need to do that inside of the Azure AD admin portal, because here I'm defining those scopes. I'm defining them using the dynamic consent. So then a little bit farther down, I'm using the authentication manager to then try and go authenticate. So here, this is when there's a problem. There's a problem over here where I had a problem with the authentication, but then here's where things were successful. So here, when things are successful, I'm getting reference to the current user. There's a success message, and I'm also getting all the other details out about this. And then I'm going to reset the two buttons. And then on the logout action, doing the same thing, except notice here I'm calling my clear credentials to show the logout action here. So let's go ahead and give this a shot. So I'm going to come over here and click play. That's going to build the application and launch the emulator. So wait for it to finish building and installing the app. We see the app's installing. There we go. Now we're ready to sign in. So let's try out our authentication code. So I'm going to click sign into Microsoft. That's going to launch the default browser, take me to the Azure AD login prompt. And now I'm going to have to type this in. So I am admin at M365X. Microsoft.com, and then let me type in my password, and then I'm going to go ahead and click sign in. So here we can check to see native O365 calendar events. That's the app that we created. It wants these permissions. So I'll go ahead and say, yep, we can grant those permissions. We can see here, authentication succeeded for the administrator. I didn't type that name in. It got that from Azure AD when it logged in. There's the email address. Click OK, and there we are. We're all signed in. And then I can sign out if I want to. Ta-da, we're all signed out. So we've got all the authentication stuff that's been set up. The next step, which we're going to see in the next section, is to then see how to integrate the Microsoft Graph. So let's go ahead and jump into that section. In this section, we're going to focus on integrating the Microsoft Graph REST API into our native iOS app. We're going to focus on the Graph iOS SDK first and talk a little bit about the Graph Service Client, making requests, and then the Graph REST API that we're going to talk to as well. Now, the Microsoft Graph iOS SDK, as I talked about earlier, only works with the Azure AD Authentication Library v1 endpoint. So if you're going to be using the Graph iOS SDK for Objective-C, you are going to be only limited to working with the v1 endpoint, and that also means you're going to be using the ADAL authentication library. And there's some information about it here on the slides. However, what we want to focus on, though, in this module is we're going to focus on using the Microsoft Authentication Library, which is the more recommended way of doing it, because that's going to target the v2 endpoint. And what that means then is that we can't use the iOS native SDK for the Microsoft Graph. Instead, we're going to be working with the Microsoft Graph REST API to handle all of our requests. Anything can talk to the REST API, and so we're going to take advantage of that in our code in this demo. So let's talk about integrating the Microsoft Graph for our iOS SDK. Now this is if we were going to be using the v1 endpoint. The Microsoft Graph provides an iOS implementation of the SDK. Again, it is tied to Azure AD or ADAL, which is the v1 endpoint. And if you wanted to use this, you can do that by leveraging CocoaPods to add the Microsoft Graph iOS SDK to your project. And you would do that with a little notation that you see here. It's very similar to the one you saw in the previous demo, where we were integrating the Microsoft Authentication Library into our application. However, you can also use the Microsoft Graph REST API inside of your iOS apps, because as we talked about, the iOS SDK for the Graph is not compatible with MSAL. And so instead what you could do is you can instead use the REST API with MSAL, which is that second option that you see there. That's a more clean way of doing it. That NXO Auth 2 is not the recommended way of doing it. It's just another option. It's probably better today to work with the Graph REST API instead. So what does the code look like for calling the Graph REST API from Objective-C? So this is just a bunch of code here that's going to show you how we can go about calling the REST API. Now, a couple things to highlight here is you look at the very top. Notice that there is my request for all of my calendar events. So I'm saying grab all of my calendar events, and I want the subject, the start, and the end date by using the $select. So that's where I'm making that request. A little bit farther down, you can see where I'm defining this request as a GET request, and then I'm also setting the header values for the content type and the accept type of what kind of data I want to get back. And then furthermore, you can see where I'm specifying the authorization header to also give me, or to specify the access token that I obtained from MSAL. The rest of the code is down at the bottom is just what happens when I get the response. So once I make the request, there's a completion handler that's going to pass in the data and the response and optional error code. And here what I'm doing is I'm just serializing or deserializing the data that I got back as JSON. And then I'm going to go update the UI by binding my JSON data to the events list for my my little view controller that I've set up here. And we'll see how this works in the demo in just a minute. But this is the main part of the code here that we're going to look at. This is the part that's issuing the request and taking the response and binding it to our application. So let's take a look at the demo. Now, again, we're going to focus on a pre-built application that is already up and running, and we're going to come back and use the if you want to see what the process of adding all of this code and writing all the code, then go check out the exercise associated with the hands-on lab that this module is associated with, or the screencast is associated with, if you want to go through and do this yourself and implement step by step. But for now, let's go ahead and let's jump back and let's actually see the demo of our application actually working in Objective-C in the simulator. All right, in this last demo, we're going to see how to incorporate the Microsoft Graph into our application. And because we're using the Microsoft Authentication Library, we're also going to be using the Microsoft Graph REST API. So what we're going to do first is we're going to create a new controller for our calendar view. So I've already gone ahead and done that. That is going to be listed right here. Here's the interface for it, or the header file. So there's our calendar table view controller, and then here is the actual code for it. Now we'll look at the code for it in just a minute here, but notice here that all I've defined here for our interface here is this events list right here. So let's go over here and let's look at our storyboard. So in our storyboard, over here in the storyboard, I'm going to select, this was called the root view controller scene that was created earlier. We're going to see how I rename this in just a minute. But if I select this guy, what I did, that's this view that we see listed right here. And what I did is on the identity inspector that we see here, I set the class equal to the class that we just created for our table view controller here. And then under the identity inspector as well, for the storyboard ID, I call it the calendar list that you see here. And then the label for it is calendar list. And that's why this got renamed over here to calendar list. So under the calendar list, we then went down and I opened this up to table view and I selected this cell, and I came over here to the attributes inspector and I set his identifier equal to the event cell table view cell. This was named something different. It was named the table view cell earlier by default you saw over here. So now once that's done, I then had to go implement the UI for this. Let me zoom in a little bit and show you what I did. So all I did was, again, using this selector here, I think it was a text field. I just grabbed these two text fields and I dragged them in to be the subject label and the date label. Now when I added this first one, I changed this font, I changed this titles to be the subject label right here, and then same thing with the date label. I did the exact same thing. I changed his label as well. Now the other thing that I did here to make this give me a little more usability with this is on the identity inspector here. Actually, I think it was on the attributes inspector. Yeah, on the attributes inspector, I set the tag of this equal to 100, and set his label or his text here to subject label so that you can see it like this. And then date, his tag is set to 200, and then the date label is set to this as well. Now, I need the code to go. I need to go implement the code for this guy. So I did that by coming over here to our calendar table view controller. So I added a couple import statements here, one for our authentication manager and one for the Microsoft Authentication Library. And then I added in the following method that you see right here for get events. So get events, it's using our authentication manager. You can see the code for this, the data URL we're going to. We're making a fetch to our REST API. You can see where there's the URL that's being defined right here. I'm creating a new request. I'm setting the request to an HTTP GET. I'm setting the content type header to application JSON, the accept header to application JSON, the authorization header equal to bearer, and then some parameter, which is going to be our access token once we authenticate, which we're going to do that right up here. And then we're going to go issue I'm going to go issue the request. And so here's where the request is being issued right here, where I'm going to go through and run this request. And here is where the results are going to be. So what happens when this thing actually runs, when the code actually runs here. So when the other thing that I'm going to have here is I'm going to add in another method here. I need to find a method here called the view did load, which there you go, view did load right here. So in the view did load, what I want to do is I want to call the init. I'm going to go through and set the events list. I'm going to go initialize it. But the important part here is I'm going to call get event. So that's how get events is being triggered. Once I go onto this view controller, this code, this method is going to get called the view did load, and that's what's going to call get events to go get all of our code. Now I got a few utility methods here that I've defined a little bit farther down. Things like getting a image with color, converting a string to another date time string with a better date format here. And then also I have this table view, which is also going to implement my implementation of my view that you see here. I have another method here that was defined. Let's see if I can find it. Here we go. Number of sections in the table view. I set this equal to 1. This had this warning here. It was not set, so I just left the warning in. But I set this equal to 1. I also said of the number of items in this, I set that equal to a count of the number of items in the event list. And then I added in one more thing here. That's this table view, and that's how the table is actually getting rendered out. Now, the next thing I need to do is that after a successful login in the application, I need to programmatically go load the calendar event view, or that view controller. And so what I need to do is go back to my login view controller, and inside of my login event, there we go, my login action, what I had to do is inside of the, let's see, where's my login section? I had to go find, inside the else statement right here, here's where, here it is right here, because remember it was called the calendar list. So I'm saying I'm going to go initialize or initiate the view controller with an identifier. So I'm initializing it right here. That's what's triggering the calendar to load once I actually log in. I log in successfully. Okay, just replace that code. So let's go see this run. So now everything should work. So now when I log in, when I click the login button, I'm now going to go load our calendar list. When our calendar list loads, right here on view did load, that's going to call the get events. Get events is going to go fetch all of this code, and when he runs, he's then going to go bind stuff to our view. So there you go, strong self table view. I'm going to go pass in the data that we received. The events list is going to get all the value from the JSON data that came back, and then I have all these utility methods that are going to run. So let's see if our application is going to run. So I'll go through and start the emulator, and come back over to the emulator, wait for it to build the application, and then install it in our iPhone emulator. And here, let's go ahead and let's sign in. So click sign in. It doesn't remember my sign in information, so we're going to need to go grab that again. And that is admin at and then 6. Let me go put the password in, and then I'll go ahead and sign in. Now that I've signed in, it takes me over to our calendar event view, and I haven't changed the name of it, you can see, but it pulls all my calendar items that were created in the last 30 days. And so you can see a list of all those different calendar items that were created in the last 30 days. Hit reload and goes and fetches that same data. So there you've seen it. You've seen how to go about creating an iOS application, adding in the Microsoft Authentication Library, and then adding in the code we need to call the Microsoft Graph REST API to show data inside of a native iOS application built with Objective-C. Again, if you want to see all the steps to actually create all this code yourself and to implement it, go check out the module that is associated with this screencast. There's a hands-on lab, and in that hands-on lab, it will walk you through an exercise on each one of the main steps that you've seen with this demo. Now we've reached the end of this screencast for this module. You've seen a lot about how to do development with the Microsoft Graph based on the topic that we've covered here. Keep in mind that everything you saw here inside the screencast accompanies a training module where you can find slides and hands-on labs and all the final solutions that we showed you in the demos inside this screencast. So if you want to learn more, I'd recommend you check out the module associated with this screencast. Again, if you remember, the demonstrations that we showed you in this screencast, they don't walk you through every single step of building the application. Rather, we just look at the final solution that we've built and we see it running, which you can expect to see. If you want to see how to go about building a solution just like this, go look at the hands-on lab exercise that accompanies this module, because each of the demos corresponds with a specific exercise from the hands-on lab. So we have steps where you can walk through each one of these things. Again, one of the reasons we don't do all of the individual steps in the screencast is because things change on a very rapid cadence in this new cloud world, and different dependencies change, version numbers change, maybe a couple of steps in screen caps are going to change as well in the hands-on lab. And so we keep the hands-on labs updated every couple months. But the videos would get out of date really quick if we tried to do that. So to save a little bit of time, we've just showed you the final solution, and we maintain the hands-on labs that you can take advantage of. I hope you got a lot out of this. There are a lot of other training modules associated with the Microsoft Graph that I'd recommend that you definitely take a look at. We've also got a couple additional links here that are at the end of the slides in the training module where you could use to learn more about this technology. So again, hope you got a lot out of this and you enjoyed this screencast. Thank you very much for taking the time to watch it.